Israel is ready to go into the promised land. They have sent out the spies into Jericho and come back and reported. Before they were able to go in, they had to prepare a little bit with the circumcision and with observing the Passover. A couple of things that reminded them of the covenant. Now, once they crossed over, that's where Joshua met the commander of the Lord, you remember, and he said, "Are you on our side or our enemies?" And he said, "No. He's on God's side. He's doing God's work." And this whole conquest is God's work. It was something he promised Abraham long ago when he said, "Look around, and everything you see, that's where I'm going to give your descendants this land." But they're going to go into slavery for a long time first, 430 years, I think it was. And this story is something that you've heard before. And I want to remind you that. I want to get your attention on this. If you're like me, you sometimes have the problem of having a coloring book perspective in your head. You've colored the picture of Noah's Ark. And that kind of becomes the depth of your theology if you're not careful. You know about Jericho. You know about them marching around. You know about the walls falling. But there's a lot more to this than just some interesting story. This isn't just to make us excited. It's not just to give us a little bit of history of Israel. It is to preach the gospel, and it is to reveal Christ. I try to read other people's perspectives as often as I can, and one thing people have a hard time with is accepting the way that God approached the Canaanites. There's no gospel message. There's no evangelist. There's simply, God gave us this land and we're here to take it. And one person believed that and agreed with that. And by faith, she did a good work and showed that she hid them from everybody else and she let them go. But no one else cared about that. They were afraid. They were filled with fear from Yahweh. They weren't going to submit to him. And God dealt with them harshly. And so some people read this and they say, well, that's just the Old Testament. God has changed since then. Or, these are just stories that are symbolic and it's just to help, establish the kingdom and keep everybody under control. We don't believe that. I don't believe that. I believe a lot more is going on here as it's laying forth Christ to us. It's telling us what it means to be saved and what it is to receive the promise. When Nicodemus was looking for that kingdom, I'm going to inherit the kingdom of God. And Jesus told him, this is what, you must be born again. This story addresses that. It tells us what it means to receive it. So I want you to look for that as the conquest begins. We're in Joshua chapter 6. Joshua chapter 6. You might want to take good notes. I'll be gone next week, and then for 2 weeks we'll be watching that video. And then the next week we're going to do church history. So we went back in here for another month. Joshua chapter 6, verse 1. And I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Now the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because the people were afraid of the Israelites. No one was allowed to go out or to come in. Or as the King James says, they were shut tightly. The idea here is that they're trying to save themselves. What is interesting to me, Rahab knew, and she confessed that all the other people knew, why the Israelites were there. We know that God's given you this land, and we know that God has marched before you, and he's won your battles for you. So they knew, and her response to that was so different than everyone else's. Her response was to say, look, I'm going to step aside. I know this is your land. God promised it to you. You're here to receive it. And whether you think that's fair or not is irrelevant. It is what God chose to do. The other people, didn't take that same approach. Their approach was to try and save themselves from God with their walls. They shut it tightly. And really you could say they were defiant. They knew what God was doing and they refused it, which is the state of natural man. That is what natural men do. And so they put their faith in the walls and they put their dependence on those walls. And so saying that, think about this. How does God get Israel into the city? By taking out the walls. It's not a coincidence that this supernatural thing happened to their walls, because that was what they were trusting in. And God's going to totally wipe that out. The Egyptians trusted in their gods. And God said, all right, you want to trust in your gods? Let's see what I can do to them. The Canaanites trusted in their walls. And God says, okay, you want to see what I can do to your walls? It's not a problem. And so none of this that's about to happen is any concern for God. The nations rage, the peoples plot in vain. The Lord has them in derision. He laughs upon his throne. He does what he wants. He sets up his own king. And that's why, verse 2, but the Lord said to Joshua, I have given you Jericho, its king, and all its strong warriors, all its valiant warriors. The Lord is not deterred by this. And I want you to notice that it's past tense. I have given. I've already given this to you. And he can do that because he already owns it. And so really what happens is the tables have turned. It wasn't that long ago that the two spies were outnumbered, outmatched, and they had to hide from the people in Jericho, from the king and from the soldiers. They were hunting. And now those who would be captors are now captive. Those who were hunters are now prey. They are the ones who have to be afraid. And this thing that God's about to do, he calls it, it's a gift. I have given this to you. This is a gift from me. It's not something that Israel earned for themselves. It's not something that they look at our mighty military, and he goes out of his way to prove that to them throughout the whole story. I want you to notice that. You are going to march, play the trumpets, and shout. I'm going to do everything else. This is totally God's victory, and so that's why he's glorified through it. It shows that nothing can stop him. Later, when I think it's David writes the psalm where he says, with the help of my God, I can scale a wall. With the help of my God, I can overcome a troop. I can take on a troop. One can put to flight 1,000. And put 10,000 soldiers running away from us because God's on our side. And with him, we can do anything. There's nothing hard. But the question is, how's God going to do it? Look at verse 3. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. On the 7th day, you are to march around the town 7 times, with the priest blowing the horns. When you hear the priest give one long blast on the ram's horns, have all the people shout as loud as they can. Then the walls of the town will collapse, and the people can charge straight into the town. So, a couple of things going on here. First, you have the warriors, and their job is to surround the city. Encompass it is what the King James says. Compass it. So, make a circle all the way around the town. And then the priests go marching all the way around it. There are only 7 priests. That's why they can't circle the town. And they're to do this for 7 days. The first 6 days, they do it one time. Everybody surrounds the city. The priests march around one time. Then the last day, they do it 7 times. And I don't know. I don't want to be too specific about the numbers, what they all mean. You know it's a number of completion. But the way I see it is it's kind of like a bullseye. He's making this ring. Right here in the middle are where my enemies are. And this is where the focus is going to be. All God's people are focused on their enemies right now and their destruction. But more than that, they're focused on the God who's the one doing the destroying. They blow their trumpets. Everybody shouts. The walls collapse. The people go in and take possession of the city. This is the battle plan. And really, I think if you were to run that past a general today, you were to say, I think what we should do is we go over there to where the Taliban is and we surround them and we blow trumpets and yell. And that's how we're going to win. That's probably not going to work. Not a good idea. But God's ways aren't our ways. He's not fighting the traditional warfare here. He's fighting in a way that glorifies him. And he's doing something spiritual. He's laying out the blueprint so that we can see how our salvation is won. Now, in the middle of all of this is the ark. The priests have to carry the ark. And what's so special about the ark? Is it magic? Does the ark have some kind of power in it? In and of itself? We talked about it a couple weeks ago. You have Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they're carrying the ark, and the Nazis want it because they know if they can get it, they have this supernatural power, they can take over the world. But that's totally ridiculous, isn't it? The ark in and of itself is a box, nothing more. But God chose to use that particular box as a symbol of his presence. And that was where he chose. When the cloud descended in the holy place, he chose to cause it to descend there. This is where the mercy seat was, where blood was sprinkled on so that people's sins could be dealt with at that place. It's the place where God met man. And this is the thing that is in the middle of them while they're fighting. The warriors go out in front. Some of the warriors trail behind. The priests go marching with it. They've got their horns. Everybody's attention is right there on the place where God is supposed to be. And when you see it like that, you see that God is the one who's leading the people, and he's the one who's doing the fighting. As for the 7 days, you remember that they had Passover right before they crossed over. They celebrated Passover, which was a celebration of their deliverance from Egypt. These next 7 days are a celebration of unleavened bread. And this battle comes during that time. So you have Passover, then you have the unleavened bread, and during that time you've got the Feast of First Fruits. We talked about all that stuff when we were going through it. This battle is a part of that celebration, and because of it, it foreshadows the gospel. It foreshadows the plenty and the provision. And it foreshadows the celebration. It is part of the celebration of God providing freedom for us and rest for us. So, with victory assured, it's really time for them to start. Look at verse 6. So Joshua called together the priests and said, "Take up the ark of the Lord's covenant and assign 7 priests to walk in front of it, each carrying a ram's horn." Then he gave orders to the people, "March around the town, and the armed men will lead the way in front of the ark of the Lord." After Joshua spoke to the people, the 7 priests with the ram's horns started marching in the presence of the Lord, blowing the horns as they marched. And the ark of the Lord's covenant followed behind them. Some of the armed men marched in front of the priests with the horns, and some behind the ark, with the priests continually blowing the horns. "Do not shout. Do not even talk," Joshua commanded. "Not a single word from any of you until I tell you to shout. Then shout." So the ark of the Lord was carried around the town once that day, and then everyone returned to spend the night in the camp. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests again carried the ark of the Lord, the 7 priests with the ram's horns marching in front of the ark of the Lord, blowing their horns. Again, the armed men marched both in front of the priests with the horns and behind the ark of the Lord. All this time, the priests were blowing their horns. On the second day, verse 14, they again marched around the town once and returned to the camp. They followed this pattern for 6 days. And on the 7th day, the Israelites got up at dawn and marched around the town as they had done before. But this time, they went around the town 7 times. So the command here is, when it's time for you to shout, when I tell you to do it, you're going to shout. "For," he says, "shout, for the Lord has given you the city." I want you to scream as loud as you can because God has delivered this over to you. And everyone in it, he says, is accursed. Pretty strong language. Everyone in it is accursed. Except for Rahab. Rahab, as you know, is the only one who is not. Because when the Israelite spies were there, they told her, they said to her, "Our lives for your lives. If we live, you live." And she saved them. So they were responsible. They had to follow through on that oath. But that was God's will, wasn't it? We read in Hebrews how it was by faith that she did that. And you know what that makes me think of? She was justified by her works. You remember when Jesus preached about the one lost sheep? He'll go out to find the one lost sheep. the wheat and the tares. This is Rahab inside that place. You remember how Lot lived in Sodom? There's a man who is also in Hebrews chapter 11, a man who is of faith, a man who is considered, was he in Hebrews 11? His righteous soul was vexed. I think that's Peter. Regardless, he's a man of faith. And he's someone who belongs to God. And Peter uses his story to say, look, Lot lived in that terrible place, and his righteous soul was vexed every day. Every day when he saw that, he was so bothered in his heart, so bothered in his conscience, because he couldn't stand to see such wickedness. But God delivered him. Remember when Abraham was intervening, and he said, well, if you just find so many people in there, will you save it? And God said, okay, if I find that. Well, what if you find, just this many? What if you find just 10 people? Will you save the city? And God goes and he obviously doesn't find 10 people. He destroys the city, but Peter says he knows how to reserve the unjust to punishment and how to preserve the righteous. He knows how to reserve and preserve. Those are the words. God knows how to get his people out of that wicked place and still pour out his wrath on it. This is the same thing he did in Canaan with those people. He knew how to reserve the Canaanites for wickedness and how to preserve the life of Rahab. And so everybody else was destroyed. And this is a strange word because it doesn't just mean that they died. It means consecrated. It's kind of a religious word. It means, how when they gave a sacrifice, they would kill it and then burn it up? Nobody got to eat the meat. All of the meat went to God. That's the same word that's used right here. They're devoted to him as sort of a sacrifice, as sort of an offering. In fact, a couple of translations put it that way. The NIV says devoted to the Lord. The New Living says offering to the Lord. They belong to God and to God alone. There's not going to be any plunder here. Nobody gets to claim any plunder from this fight. The only thing they're going to get is the land. But everything else belongs to God. You get no slaves, you get no wives, you get no animals, you get no crops. Everything is supposed to be destroyed. And the treasure also belongs to God, the gold and the brass and silver. And they're going to take that stuff and put it in the treasury. Basically give it to God. And in the next chapter, we're going to see in a month, a man named Achan, when they go and defeat a city called Ai, and a man named Achan hides some of the treasure that he found. He goes into the city, he does his fighting, he comes across some stuff he wants to keep. He steals it, he's secretive about it, he buries it under his tent. But God said basically, to take that stuff against my command is to steal from me. I told you that stuff belongs to me, and he and his whole family were executed because of it. So, the city is going to be destroyed. Rahab will be saved. All of it is for God's glory. All of it belongs to God. Look at verse 20. Did I already read that? Do not take... I think I skipped some. Let's go back. Let's start at verse 16. Seventh time around, as the priests sounded the long blast, God said, shout, for he's given you the city. Verse 17, Jericho and everything in it must be completely destroyed as an offering to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and the others in her house will be spared, for she protected our spies. Do not take any of the things set apart for destruction, or you yourselves will be completely destroyed, and you will bring trouble on the camp of Israel. Everything made from silver, gold, bronze, or iron is sacred to the Lord and must be brought into his treasury. There we go. I got ahead of myself a little bit. So, when the people heard the sound of the ram's horns, they shouted as loud as they could. Suddenly, the walls of Jericho collapsed, and the Israelites charged straight into the town and captured it. They completely destroyed everything in it with their swords, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys. Meanwhile, Joshua said to the two spies, keep your promise, go to the prostitute's house and bring her out along with all her family. So, they shout, and the walls completely fall. And I imagine, remember Rahab's house was built into the side of the wall. So you know that not 100% of it fell, but they were in her house, so they couldn't have fallen. So I imagine these large areas of the wall just crumble. And that's what the word is. It's just like they just collapse under their own weight. They were there, and now they're not. However, God decided to do it. And this obstacle is totally removed. When the Israelites saw what happened, they gave this loud shout. They go rushing in, and they killed everybody who was there. And I want you to notice that. Look at verse 21. They completely destroyed what? Everything. They completely destroyed everything in it with their swords. And what does that mean? Who did they kill? Was it probably it was just a bunch of soldiers and they had already gotten everyone else out, right? What's it say? Men and women, young and old, and all the animals. This was an absolute massacre, and some people have even called it genocide. They destroyed the entire city. Some people find that very repulsive. And frankly, if it wasn't in the Bible, I think all of us would find it repulsive, wouldn't we? If you read on the news that somebody surrounded the town of Milry and killed everyone in it. An army surrounded that city and they destroyed everyone in it. How would you feel? You'd be repulsed. You'd be terrified. You'd be angry. There wouldn't be any thoughts of joy or happiness here. And the way it makes people feel, you know who Richard Dawkins is? You know somebody who calls him a Sith Lord. He's an atheist who hates God. And here's what he had to say. I want to read you this quote because it's how people feel when they read this passage. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Not very happy about God. But what? What are we supposed to do with this story when we hear this? They went in and they killed everybody, young and old. They killed the babies. They killed the women. They killed the pregnant women. And they did it at the command of God. What are we supposed to do with this story? Some people have said, well, I just think that this is a different God than it is in the New Testament. We don't serve that same God. He's changed. Maybe he matured. He had a violent, hot temper when he was young, but now he's a little older. He's had some time to rethink his ways. Is that right? I change not, says the Lord. That's why you sons of Jacob are not consumed, because I don't change. He's the same today, yesterday, and forever. So you can't use that excuse. The God of the New Testament is the God of the Old Testament. And if you hate one, you hate them both. Some people say, well, this is just symbolic language. They're just trying to, establish their kingdom here. Trying to say this is what it is. What do you think about that? I don't think that's what it is either. I don't think it does you any good anyway. Because what difference does it make? He's approving of this. Whether he's doing it symbolically or literally, he approves. What do we do with this? I want to remind you of a couple of things. And it's a couple of things that tend to escape. I don't mind when it escapes unbelievers because I don't expect them to understand this. The fact that they don't understand this is why they're unbelievers. But when believers have a hard time with this, it makes me wonder, do you know who God is and do you know who you are? First of all, does not the potter have the right to do with the clay as he wishes? That's a verse, right? He created them. He has the right to do what he wants. But then you say, but that's an inanimate object. I mean, these people are not inanimate objects. They're not pots of clay. They're people. And they have value inside of themselves. What about that? You know what? That's true. They're not inanimate objects. They're far worse. They're sinners created in the image of Adam. Created after Adam. And what does Paul teach us in Romans chapter 3 about these people? There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that seeks God. There is none who understands. They have each gone after their own way. In fact, the description that he gives is that the poison of asps is under their lips. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. Their feet are swift to shed blood. These people are utterly depraved. And when you come away from that, you see, that's the problem, is that people come away from that and they see the value of a human being. We see value in human beings. God sees value in human beings. But you can't take away the wickedness of a man's heart. A man's heart is wicked, beyond understanding, beyond cure. And when God sees them, it's His will to pour out His wrath on them. They deserved everything they got. You say, well, but the babies didn't deserve that. Why? Is God unjust? Would He do something wrong? Is God a murderer? Is he what's Dawkins say? He's an infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal bully. Filicidal means you kill your own children. Kill babies. Kill groups of people. All of these people are born after Adam. David says, I was sinful at birth. It's who we are. It's who I am. It's who you are. When somebody says, have you ever sinned? We might say, I know I'm not perfect. But do you understand what that means to confess that you have sinned? The wages of sin is death. You say, yeah, but I've never murdered. I've never committed adultery. I just do little things. You're the one who's putting that scale on that. God didn't do that. God doesn't say, well, these sins are really bad, but I can let these slide. No, the wages of sin is death, and there is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. These people were devoted to Him. That's what it meant. They were destroyed. They belong to me because they owe me. They don't owe the Israelites anything. The Israelites are just as wicked as they are. And so God has the right to destroy them because He's the potter, and they have earned this because they hate God. They prove that when they shut their gates up. We know what He wants, but we're not going to let Him have it. We know that He is supposed to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, but we're not going to crown Him. We know that He is the Lord of the hosts of heaven, but we are not going to surrender. Another thing to think about. Was there a way out? There was a way out, wasn't there? All you had to do was go to Rahab's house. Would you have died? Nope. I think that's the point of that story. The point of that part of the story. There was grace. There was grace. There was a way out for those who believed. Rahab was of faith. She had faith, and that's why she said, I'm going to help you get through this. I submit to this king. I surrender to this warrior. Whatever you want me to do, I'm going to help you get it done. She was justified, James says, by her works. Finally, the last reason that this is necessary, he tells them you have to destroy all these people. King James says, lest you make yourselves accursed. If you don't kill all these Canaanites, their bad ways are going to influence you. You see, they don't submit to this king, and if this king is merciful to them, if I don't have justice on them, they're going to start leading you astray. And so that's why you can't keep anything. And that was a real problem for Israel. When they got into the cities, they didn't destroy it. It was predicted. You're going to start worshiping their gods, you're going to marry their daughters, and you're going to fall away from me. And that's exactly what they did. Doesn't take long to see. Judges chapter 3, 5, 6, and 7. That's what they're doing. They failed to do it, and they're leaving God already. So, when we read this part of the story, if you're tempted, if you say, man, I don't know about this. This is awfully hard for me to see how God could do that. I want you to remember this. All these people earned what they got. And God, as the judge of all the earth, you and I are not the judges of the earth. And the covenant has changed. That is different. The God of the covenants is the same, but the covenants have changed. We're under the new covenant now. This isn't how it operates. But you know what? This is how it's going to end. Do you read Revelation in this? I mean, what if he just said, when I open the scrolls, all the hosts of heaven are going to come in and destroy them, and there's going to be so much blood, it's going to cover miles and go up several feet. This is the same thing Revelation says, is it not? God judges his enemies. God judges the wicked and destroys them. So if you have a problem with this, if you don't have a problem with this, you don't have a problem with Revelation. God is the king and the rightful judge of all the earth. So Joshua in verse 22 told the spies to go get Rahab and bring her out. And they did. Verse 23. They went in and brought Ahab, her father, mother, brothers, and all the other relatives who were with her. They moved her whole family to a safe place near the camp of Israel. Then the Israelites burned the town and everything in it. Only the things made from silver, gold, bronze, or iron were kept for the treasury of the Lord's house. So Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute and her relatives who were with her in the house, because she had hidden the spies Joshua sent to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. At the same time, Joshua invoked this curse. May the curse of the Lord fall on anyone who tries to rebuild the town of Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundation. At the cost of his youngest son, he will set up its gates. So the Lord is with Joshua, and his reputation spread throughout all the land. So what we see here is that Joshua kept his word, and I think that showing us grace is an important part of this story. The grace that Rahab received because of faith was shown when Joshua kept his word, and the people followed through. They went in there and they totally destroyed. I wish that they could do this every time, but they're not going to, are they? There's the next chapter. They're not going to burn everything. But in this case, everything else was destroyed, and it's this total and divine judgment. And when it's done, Joshua looks around. I just picture the smoldering piles and the dead bodies. He looks around and he says, you know what? Anybody who thinks he's going to come and rebuild this place is going to fall under a curse. And it's not just that they're going to live there. The idea is anyone who builds the foundation and puts the gates back up, anyone who tries to undo what God has done. God came in here and he judged those people. He took their walls down. Anybody who tries to reverse that is under a curse. Go to the book of 1 Kings, chapter 16. Go to the last verse. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34. In his days, a man named Heel the Bethelite built Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua the son of Nun. You know what that's saying? This man didn't believe that prophecy. He didn't believe that curse. And so he went and rebuilt the gates. He laid the foundation again, and he lost his oldest and his youngest son. The prophecy that Joshua proclaimed all the way back here in that book comes true later on. If you want to reverse this curse, if you want to change what God has done, you're going to do it in suffering. Not going to accomplish it. It's a warning to these people. There's never a time for this wickedness to come back up. Now, do you see the overall promise in this? When God takes his people out of Egypt, he gets them through the wilderness, he gets them across the Jordan, he gets them right up to the first city of the promised land. When God destroys those walls and brings his people in for rest, he gives them the food of that place. There's never a time, there's never an occasion when that gets undone. There's never a time for wickedness to come back in that city. This city belongs to God, and he will keep it. Man, that makes me think, it points me to the eternal security of the saints. It points me to God's work in our salvation, how he keeps the walls down. There is no recovery from this. There isn't another chance. It's over. God has secured the promise for his people. When we come back next time, we're going to read about Achan's sin at Ai. Before we do, I just have two quick statements. We usually compare the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and I want to do that in just two simple statements. The Old Covenant points forward to a time when God will destroy all his enemies and deliver the promise to his people. The Old Covenant points forward to a time when God will destroy all his enemies and deliver the promise to his people. The New Covenant shows that the victory is already won in Christ, and we participate through faith. We are heirs with him by faith, and he has won the battle already. Jesus, we thank you for your salvation. We thank you that you are God of all, Lord of all. God, I pray that when we read these things, when we hear about death and murder, your word teaches us that you take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. And Lord, it is revolting to hear about massacres. But at the same time, the righteous rejoice when the wicked are overcome. And I pray that we wouldn't fall prey to that. We wouldn't fall into that trap of not being able to see the justice of God as a good thing. Lord, we cherish it. We look forward to it because the wrath that is poured out on the world is deserved. And we know that we can say that with absolute humility. Any wrath that you poured out on us is deserved, but thankfully you poured it out on your Son. As the potter, you have the right to do as you will with the clay. And so may this make us even more humble. May it make us even more grateful, even more responsive. May this make us obedient, because you alone are worthy to be praised. You're the God who tears down the walls of the wicked and pours out your wrath in judgment and gives good things to his people. So we trust you. Bless us and be glorified. In your name we pray. Amen.